An off-grid system is when you're not connected to the utility. That might be because you live 3-4 kilometres up the road, or whether you might just choose to be off-grid because you want to be. Now, what does an off-grid system look like? Well, traditionally an off-grid system would be a cabin up in the bush, fairly conservative house. They may have had half a dozen solar panels on the roof. The solar system would provide lighting and some basic appliances, but it was a fairly conservative type of solution. It's been interesting to see how off-grid systems have developed even in the last 10 years, to see where they've come from there to where they are now, where there's larger solar arrays, higher powered inverters, high performance batteries, and how an off-grid system is something more achievable and can actually run a normal house. So I always get asked, I want to go off-grid. First thing I'd say is if you're already connected to the grid, I'd suggest you stay connected to the grid, because we have a nice battery solar solution that works perfectly for a non-grid application. If you want to go totally off-grid, then it adds a whole lot of layers of things to think about. You may need to change your appliances, you need to think about where you're going to put a backup generator, you're going to think about where you're going to put your battery and inverter system, and it actually just totally changes your lifestyle and the way you want to live. So firstly, this is the battery inverter, which is the main brain. It's controlling and managing everything that's going on in the off-grid system. It's connected to the house, provides power to the house. It's also connected to the battery. And the battery is charged and discharged via the battery inverter. Now there's two different ways you can connect a solar system to an off-grid power system. One way is on the DC side. Now the DC side of the system is the side that has the battery, which is normally 48 volts. The solar array on the DC side is connected through to the battery via a DC charger or a charge controller. It supplies energy directly to the battery to charge the battery, and then also via the battery inverter out that way. The other way you can charge a solar system is on the AC side, and this is slightly more like what you would see on a normal grid connected house, because the solar inverter is connected to the AC side of the battery inverter. This way of providing energy is actually more efficient, because the solar generated energy can go directly in and directly to your house. So for example, the solar system's producing 5 kilowatts and your house is using 3 kilowatts, then 3 kilowatts is going directly into your house and the other 2 kilowatts is travelling back through the battery inverter and charging your battery. So it's a very efficient way to run an off-grid system. Now a really important part of an off-grid system is the generator. The generator is there to charge the battery when you can't get enough input from your solar. For example, in the middle of winter, where you've had cloud for 2 weeks and the house is steadily draining the battery, the generator can be programmed to automatically start, charge the battery, as well as supply loads to the house. Now, an important consideration with your generator is that it has a clean output. It's really important because when the generator is running, it's actually synchronized with your house as well as with your battery. So any power that's coming out of your generator is actually going into your house. So it's important that that output is nice and clean. The other inputs you can also have in an off-grid system is hydro and wind. There's a couple of things to mention about that, especially with wind. Traditionally, off-grid systems had half a dozen solar panels because solar panels were so expensive, and maybe a little wind turbine up on the hill. Now, the problem with wind is the infrastructure is quite expensive. There's ongoing maintenance and they're actually not that effective. What's changed in recent years is because solar panel prices have reduced so much, the solar systems that are going in an off-grid system are increasing, which means that wind is less and less and less used. It's not to say that it shouldn't be used and there aren't applications where you can use it, but you need to make sure that you've actually got a really good site for wind and that you've actually got some wind data to prove that it's a good site. Just because it's windy doesn't mean it's going to be a good site. The other input you could consider is hydro. And the same thing with hydro. The capital cost to put in a hydro system is quite high. You might have a creek running through your property where you can collect water at the top part of your property. You can divert it into a pipe, send it down through the turbine and then put it back into the river. But it's really important that you have a certain amount of head pressure to make it viable, and also a certain amount of flow. A lot of micro hydro systems will only operate in winter and not in summer, and usually that's not a problem because in summer you've got so much solar generation coming in that you don't need your hydro. So there's a lot of effective hydro systems out there, but the same thing, you need to be careful because you might find you're spending a lot of money and actually not getting a very big advantage. And like I said before, solar panels are so cheap. So often a more effective way is increasing your solar array and increasing your battery so that you can store more of that energy and in the end achieve the same result by providing a more reliable system. One really important thing to note about the battery is it needs to be sized correctly. And so often with off-grid systems, batteries are undersized, or cheap batteries are used, or the wrong technology is used, and often that's the weak link in any off-grid system. As far as the cost breakup goes, your battery is probably half the cost of the entire system. So it's really, really important that that is sized correctly. So to work out what size battery you need, we need to determine the entire system and what the application is. So the first thing we do is work out how many kilowatt hours per day you use, and to do that we do a load calculation. So we add up all your appliances, your lights, TVs, whatever you use, and we come up to a figure. It might be 12 kilowatt hours per day. Then what we need to do is work out, well, how many days do we want the system to be able to operate off the battery without anything coming in from the solar? And based on all that information, we can determine the size of the battery. Now, once we've determined that, we need to work out how on earth we're going to charge it. Now, assuming that you've just got solar coming in, we would size the solar array suitably to be able to adequately charge the battery, as well as supply the loads in the house during the day, and that the battery is full at night to be able to run the house at night. The battery inverter is also a really important part, and we size that depending on what loads you've got in the house. Now, you might have a welder in the shed, or you might have a large pump, and that'll determine the size of the battery inverter, because it needs to be able to provide whatever you turn on in the house whenever you do it. So if you've got a little battery inverter and you turn on a big load, you might overload the inverter, or you may even overload the battery. Then we have the size of the generator. It's really important to get that right. No use having a great big generator with a small battery, because it's just going to trickle charge through there and the generator will be running at no load. So getting the generator size correctly is also a really important part. So to recap, battery is the most important part, getting that right. Then we have the solar input, need to size that accordingly. The size of the battery inverter so that we can deliver enough power to the house, and then sizing the generator accordingly. And then we end up with a very happy house. Lastly, can I upgrade my system? Well, the answer is yes. So the solar side of the system can be easily upgraded. It's modular, we can always add panels, we can always add inverters, not a problem. The battery, depending on what type of battery you use. If you use a lead acid battery, it's very tricky to upgrade. If you use a high performance lithium battery, then it's really easy to upgrade. And lastly, there's the battery inverter. It cannot be upgraded, so you need to get it right straight up. Some other considerations for an off-grid system: monitoring and the ability for us to be able to connect in remotely and change settings. So the SB Pro, for example, has all that functionality built into it. We're able to connect in remotely. You're able to monitor your system. One of the other beautiful things with this, and which I really, really love, is there's a nice graphical display on the front. It's nothing too complicated, it's nice and simple, and it gives you the basic information that you need. How full is my battery? You can see what charge mode it's in. You can also see what charging source is connected to it at the moment. You can see if there's an alarm up, the system's actually on. You'll also be able to see whether the generator's running. You can even manually start the generator by pushing this button here, and it will show you whether it's connected. It's a really nice, simple, visual explanation of how your system's operating. So often with off-grid systems, they can be so complex and people really don't understand what they're looking at. And this is just a really simple way to get a nice overview of the system.